The Pentax 17 is a brand new film camera, the first film camera by Pentax in something like 20 years. It's a small, light, fixed lens, unique shooting experience that's also a half-frame film camera. Welcome to the second part of my film series. In episode 1, which you can find in the link below, I dove into the Nikon F2. It's a 1970s film photography camera. And then I demonstrated how I take those images from the film strip and capture them digitally and bring them into Lightroom so that I could edit them there. That was a very eye-opening experience. It was my first time working with film, and this is all to lead up to shooting with Adam's Aeroflex 35mm motion picture camera to bring that into a shop and shoot a one-day build on this thing. But before we get there, I have a lot more film to play with, a lot more toys to play with, including this Pentax 17. Now, this is a pretty unique camera in that it shoots half frame. It's not a new it's not a new system. Half frame has been around for a long time, but this is a brand new camera from Pentax. Before we get into half frame, I want to talk a little bit about motion picture cameras and the 4-perf, 3-perf, even 2-perf shooting method, because I knew kind of abstractly what that was for and what that did, but I really wanted to find out why. Especially if I'm going to be shooting with Adam's Aeroflex camera, I sort of need to know what kind of format I'm going to be shooting with. This is a 4-perf camera, just for reference, but it can be converted to be 3-perf and 2-perf. But what does that even mean, really? Now, when you look at a 35mm film strip, it's really just a strip of film, in this case, polyester, I guess, and back in the day, it used to be celluloid. But really, it's just a blank strip. It doesn't really have a bounding box. It doesn't really have a frame. It's not capturing the image to a box that's in there. It is creating the box. A motion picture camera runs these things vertically, while a film photography camera runs these things horizontally. So the perfs on the side here represent sort of how much of the image that is being exposed from the gate, right? And so an Aeroflex like this, or the more standard version of motion picture film capture, was using 4-perf. So if you take 4 perforations of this film strip and make a little box around it, that is the image that is being captured. Now, as a way of cutting costs, they started to reduce the gate size of the camera and adjust the speed to capture on 3-perfs. So you're actually capturing a shorter image. It's not as tall. It still has that same width. It just gets a little bit shorter, thus dictating the aspect ratios, signifying aspect ratio changes throughout the years of film history. But you're using a lot less of the film, meaning that you can capture a lot more per foot of film. So you can see the cost savings there, because now you're not only saving on the cost of film, but also developing in general. And then you get to like 2-perf, which is more specialty, but that you think about spaghetti westerns back in the day, you know, they were shot dirt cheap. They needed to shoot a lot of film and also make it look very cinescope, very, very wide, right? And so they're shooting on 2-perfs. They're using 2-perfs of this thing, cutting the cost way down while also getting this super wide image. Again, you're slightly changing the image. You're getting a little more grain. You're blowing this thing up to be projected onto a 4-perf, or back in the day, a 4-perf projection in a theater was still going to be 4-perf. And so they needed to take that 2-perf that they shot, and once they're ready to publish that and bring it out to the world, they put that back onto a 4-perf, and it looks like a specific aspect ratio, 185, 183, or 16:9 in the 3-perf sense. So all this jargon is all my way of saying that they found ways of cutting the cost of film by using less of the film that was being exposed. So you actually have to manually change the gates and the speed on these cameras here, including the Pentax 17, which is a half-frame camera, which instead of shooting on this entire 35mm box here, you're actually only shooting on 17mm. So you're getting double the exposure. So your 36 goes to 72, which is a lot of pictures to take. I have only shot 2 rolls before this review because it's like 144 pictures that I had to get through. So with all that out of the way, before we get into the motion picture aspects of this, let's go into a little more detail about the Pentax 17 and its half-frame abilities now. The name is really telling us everything we need to know. The Pentax 17, it's using 17mm of the 35mm frame because it is cut in half. Now, because it is half frame and film through a film photography camera runs horizontally, its default orientation is going to be your portrait. It's going to be your vertical mode, and this is going to be your landscape. So already it's a little bit of a backwards way of thinking. This is probably going to be more comfortable for folks coming from the iPhone, coming from smartphones who are used to shooting in portrait mode as sort of a default. This is going to give you that by default as well. Full disclosure, Pentax did send me this camera on loan for use and review. They're not seeing this video before it goes live. No money has been exchanged, but just full disclosure. So let's get into the features of this camera. For those who are coming over from a more traditional or manual digital photography background, may need a moment to sort of adjust themselves to what this camera is doing, because there's a lot of automation in this camera, and what you are doing is sort of guiding that automation. You don't really have exposure control. Again, you're just sort of guiding the exposure. You're using focus zones. All of these things are sort of untraditional when it comes to film photography. Now, for loading and unloading your film, there's nothing new here. This should all feel pretty familiar. This system does feel pretty solid as far as I can tell. After you load your film, you dial in your ISO or ASA to what your film is rated at. You do your exposure adjustment compensation with that dial here. For the settings here, you'll see two different areas. There's this white zone and then there's this yellow zone. They're almost mirrored. The white really just means no flash and the yellow means flash. And so we'll get into that in a second. So when you select your program mode, your P here, what the camera is gonna do is it's gonna set a reasonable aperture and a reasonable shutter to get you your exposure. No flash with the white zone again. I think the aperture it chooses to hang out in is around like 8, and then it adjusts your shutter. That's also, again, reasonable. I think the shutter maxes out at like 1/350th of a second. So it doesn't go as fast as like the Nikon F2, which was like a 1/2000th of a second. But from there, that's all automated. You don't need to think about that. What you're gonna have to think about is your focus zone. Now, there's no manual focus on this in the way that you would think as a manual photographer. These zones are clickable. You're basically gonna click into the area that you think this camera is going to be focused on. So there are meters and feet at the bottom to give you a sort of a general guideline, 1.7 feet, 4 feet, 5.6 feet, 10. But on the top, there are these little pictures. And if you ever used an old like Holga camera, this will be very familiar with you. You got your picture of a flower, you have some picture of a food, a person, 2 people, 3 or many people, and then landscape. And so you're gonna sort of, eyeball it into some regard of how close you are from your subject and take your picture. Now, this may seem crazy because, we're used to full frame cameras, we're used to shallow depths of field. This is a half frame camera. So essentially a 16, 17 millimeter film frame, which is not something that a lot of people shoot in these days. But know that the smaller that your sensor size or your film size, the deeper the focus is gonna be, especially with this wide angle lens of 25 millimeter. I think the 25 millimeter is probably 30 something equivalent, but you're gonna have a pretty deep depth of field, especially with the f8 on this camera. So your zones are gonna be pretty forgiving. I was a little bit I was very nervous shooting a bunch of pictures with this, with the focus zones, especially not seeing the live view. It's a little bit hard to get used to, is that the viewfinder doesn't have any kind of live view. So you're not seeing a live focus change. You're just seeing an optical pass through. It's very sharp, and it gives you some guidelines, and you see some of your focus images at the bottom, like all those symbols that I talked about. So you get all that data through the viewfinder, but that's it. You're not seeing that focus change. So you're really gonna have to trust your focus zone and your subjects are where they need to be. But again, it's a pretty forgiving system. There is a lot of play there in terms of how sharp you want your images. And sharp, again, is relative because this is a 17 millimeter camera. You're gonna have a little bit of softness from that style of film. That's just how the nature of what that is. From there, we'll go to the next setting, which is a little moon symbol. The moon symbol is basically closing down your aperture to like 16. So you're as close down as can be. And then it's gonna use all shutter to adjust your exposure. Still, again, totally automated exposure, still manual focus ring, manual focus zone. But now you're gonna get a much slower shutter. And so you might wanna use sticks for this. It might be some nighttime stuff. It might be some landscape stuff where you want that close down aperture. But that's gonna be your moon. Bokeh is gonna do the flip side of that. It's gonna take your aperture from 16, it's gonna take it down to 3.5, which is as wide as it can be, or as open as it can be, and then it's gonna use the shutter again to find that exposure using the manual focus zone. B is bulb. You press down the shutter, hold it. As long as you hold it, the shutter is gonna stay open. Again, the yellow or the gold here is all just with a flash. So program mode with a flash. Moon mode with a flash. Those are the only two there. Flash is one thing that I've never really used in photography that I've actually been having a lot of fun with here. A little bit for exposure control, but more for stylistically. Like I've just, this camera and the way this camera wants to be used, it sort of likes that, spontaneous picture taking flash environments, kind of chaos. It's a cool stylistic choice that I have been having fun playing with on this camera. Now for auto mode. Auto mode is gonna be basically auto everything. Auto shutter, auto aperture, with a flash if needed. So it'll decide if it wants to use the flash. And because there's no autofocus on this camera, it's basically just gonna change your zone to a landscape. Regardless of what you have the ring set to, it's always just gonna have it on landscape, close down that aperture as much as it can. So it wants you to get something that's relatively sharp without having to think about it. This is the setting that I would just hand to my daughter or some stranger and say, hey, take a picture. And again, that flash is gonna be used regardless of whether you want it or not. If the camera thinks you need the flash on auto, it's gonna use the flash. The advanced lever feels nice and snappy. It's not too long. Everything feels really good in the hand. As a one-handed kind of plasticky camera, this feels really good. Holding it with one hand, I can operate everything. I can advance and shoot if I needed to. It has an on and off button. So there's a battery in the hand grip here. It's a little C2 battery. You can find those pretty much anywhere. And it has a very long battery life because I think if you turn it on, forget your camera's on, I think it'll kind of go into sleep mode. And so you don't have to worry about burning through those batteries too much. But what that powers is that's gonna power the flash, and it's also gonna power the focusing. You are manually selecting these focus zones, but you're not actually you're not changing any of the optics or any physical elements in there. What you're doing is every time you change it, and then you advance the shutter or advance the lever and hit the shutter, the camera quickly goes into the zone that you set it to, takes a picture, and then kind of defaults back. That is most of the time that's imperceptible. I think if you're hovering somewhere in the earlier, like the 1.7 or the 0.8, you're not going to feel it as much. But once you get in the landscape, there's going to be more optics that move, and you can sort of feel that time. And there's like a couple milliseconds where there was a little bit of delay. It's something I definitely feel. I think most people aren't going to have an issue with that. I really like that tactile that the Nikon F2, just immediate shutter control. This has a little bit of a to it. Now, physically, that's about all this camera really has. It's a strange camera in that it feels sort of plasticky and toy-like, but also feels good. It holds in the hand really well. It's super light, so I can just toss this in a jacket. The viewfinder, while again, I don't know if I like not having a live view when it comes to the focus stuff. I mean, I'd really like to just know if I'm somewhere in the ballpark, but it's a pretty crystal clear. Seeing the exposure or seeing the focus zones is pretty easy. I like the guidelines that they have in there. It's an easy camera to use once you've shot a roll. I think you need to shoot a full roll, get it developed, feel that out. It's definitely not a camera that I would just hand to anybody coming from like a digital background. I think this camera has a strange, market to it. It's sort of for people who I think want to get into film, who don't have the burden of like knowledge of manual cameras and aren't bringing that with them, they want to get into film photography. They shoot a lot of pictures with their phone. This is something that they can sort of learn. It's sort of some newer verbiage in terms of what the settings are. There's some things they don't have to think about, some things that they do. It gives them just enough manual control to get them images that they would like to express creatively. But again, you're gonna get the images from the film stock you're loading into. So these images that I shot here, this was with Kodak Gold, this was Portra 400. I have some black and white photography in here now. So all that stuff, like all those exposed really well. Like the focus zone stuff, once I got used to it, it came out well. I think optically, this lens is pretty sharp. It looks pretty nice. Now, this has been a fun camera to shoot with. It feels both casual and also pretty powerful, while at the same time physically feeling cheap, but also well constructed. So it's this crazy mix of things. But also we can't ignore the price on this thing. This thing goes for $500. $500 for a film camera. Granted, there's not a whole lot of other products new products like this in the market to really compare to, but for things like not having an automated lens cap sort of built in. This thing comes with lens caps that I have lost once, bought another one, lost it again. Just having an extra piece to put in my pocket didn't seem right for this kind of camera. You kind of want to turn it on and you want to see the lens open up through a little window. Not having that live focus view, I think, is a little, these are all creature comforts that I think would be nice and may help, for me at least, to justify that price in the $500. But you be the judge if this is worth that for you if you are looking to get into film photography. But a very unique, very fun camera that I've had a great time shooting with. The Pentax 17 half-frame film camera in contrast to last episode, which was my 1970s film camera, introducing you all to the concept of half frame, 4-perf, 3-perf, as we move forward to getting this beast into Adam's shop and shooting some magazines. So thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for episode 3, which hopefully will be coming out within the next month. Until then, I'll see you guys all next time.